Hi, Connor. Thank you so much for meeting with me today. I am so thankful that you took time out of your day to do this. If you could please just introduce yourself to the people before we begin.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. So my name's Conor Foley. My pronouns are they, them. I'm the pastor of a church in New Jersey, in Woodbridge, New Jersey. It goes by First Congregational Church of Woodbridge. But also there's a project that I'm starting from within it called Firelight Community, which is a space for people who are not perhaps particularly religious, who certainly perhaps aren't Christian, but have some need in their life for spiritual community of some kind. And it's also sort of organized by radical politics. There's a lot of people in my life, a lot of folks that I know who are interested in joining together struggle and spirituality, revolutionary praxis, and connection to one's soul, oneself, to the deepest parts of the human experience. And so it's sort of an experiment that we're trying in that space. So I do that as well. I'm also the state coordinator for Abolition Apostles, which is a national Christian abolitionist organization who does all sorts of good work, and hopefully we'll talk about that throughout this conversation. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Cool. Thanks so much for your introduction. So first, I want to get into if you could talk about how you got your start in abolition work.
Yeah. So, I think it starts from birth in a lot of ways. I mean, growing up in a radical context, radical in sort of the opposite way one would imagine, but in this fundamentalist Christian group that was very apocalyptic in outlook, very fringe, very extreme in its beliefs. And so grew up just sort of occupying that space of seeing the world in a way that was radically different from everyone else around me, and in a way that was very harmful, was extremely unproductive, was violent in so many ways. But it did provide this grounding in social action in a certain way, where so much of what we did was engaging with the community, being out in the world, trying to convert people to our worldview, which of course was extreme, but we became comfortable with, holding worldview like that. Grew up in a place that was pretty intense in a lot of ways. Highest unemployment rate in the nation, lots of violence of various kinds. We had a high school called the Yuma High Criminals, which was wild. A lot of folks there too, like had some connection to the carceral system. The football team would run onto the field with cop cars chasing them. So there was just this atmosphere of carcerality, being right by the border. That just being the way of things. I've a number of friends that I grew up with who are incarcerated. My sister was incarcerated. Just lots of connections to prisons and police, just given where I grew up, and choices, situations that my family has been in. So the realities of carcerality were just familiar with me, even though I had no language for them. Just sort of the basic, American understanding of these different systems as legitimate, as good, as providing safety and health. And if you do something bad and you go to jail or prison, like, you deserved that. And, so just a totally uncritical engagement with these things that were nevertheless a reality for me. And so then really around 2014, 2015, the Ferguson uprising, the movement for Black Lives, seeing that, wondering what the heck that was about, starting to understand that conversation a little bit, and then making those very easy connections, between some of my experiences and the experiences of those closest to me with this movement, the movement for Black Lives, which is in many ways not just about policing, but that's sort of the most visible point, right? Where you see this, you see the violence of the carceral state visited upon the bodies of innocent, unarmed people. And you start seeing that there's a logic to this. There's a reason why these people keep dying. And it has everything to do with American history, with American racism, with capitalism, with Christianity, in fact. So putting those pieces together, having instruction by people who have been radicalized long before me, who put me onto the right books, the right reading, the right learning, and became an abolitionist, at least in theory. And then, okay, you hold abolitionist convictions. Now, then what are you doing to realize abolition? And so, if I am acting as an abolitionist in any way, it's simply trying to organize people around it at the moment. And so my start into actually organizing has been Abolition Apostles, the National Christian Abolitionist organization that is doing work to connect people who are invested in abolition and realize that in material ways. And so that's sort of where I am now, really still at the beginning of my lived abolitionism.
So how are you finding it maybe easy or difficult to marry abolition and faith, at least in maybe messages that you're preaching to folks that attend your church?
Yeah, that's just another one of the things that comes so simply and so easily once you see it. Christians as folks who perhaps worship Jesus, there's some communities that maybe they wouldn't think of it in those terms, but the center of this tradition, the center of this faith is Jesus, right? Who was an oppressed Palestinian Jew, right, under the heel of an imperial state, who was incarcerated and executed by the state because he was a problem. He was a troublemaker. And so it seemed it should be so obvious for a Christian to be able to see, okay, these systems sometimes are organized by totally anti-Christ powers, by things that are completely ungodly in the most visceral and obvious sense, where they are the things that kill Christ, And so Jesus says things like in Matthew 25, he says that insofar as you do or don't minister to the prisoner, you do or don't minister to me. So there's this ontological identification with the prisoner, not just as an analogy, just I'm like prisoners, sort of my experience is similar to what prisoners have gone through because we've both been, he says, I am that. Like if you are not out in the world caring for that person, then you're not caring for me. And he's putting this in the context of the Last Judgment, saying if you are not out in the world caring for prisoners, you're not going to make it to heaven, essentially. So pretty high stakes. In Acts, in the book of Acts, Acts 16, at one point, it says the Holy Spirit shook the foundations of the prison, and every door was open, and everybody is released by the Spirit of God, right? Regardless of guilt or any innocence, the Spirit of God liberates every prisoner from the prison, which just suggests something about what the prison is and how God would relate to it, right? The only instances we have of God relating to these institutions is in an antagonistic attitude towards these institutions. So it doesn't mean it's easy to get people to see that, but the stories are there. There's so much work that has to be undone, so many preconceived notions of what the state and what the prison and what cops are. But Jesus was killed by cops, right? Like that's just a fact. That's not an incendiary tagline or just ideology. That's just the fact of the nature. These folks acting on behalf of the state to control these populations. They're the ones who killed Christ, and there is a near perfect analogy between that and our situation today. So just trying to get folks to see that as often as possible through sermons, through education. I've done a few, church study groups on issues of mass incarceration, on race and carcerality, through a couple churches in New York. The one that I'm at currently, and Abolition Apostles, does a lot of political education around these issues in ways that are framed by theology. So there are lots and lots of connections between theology, the church, and the work of abolition.
Thanks. Yeah. So I guess a follow-up question to that would be, what is it like, or what has your experience been like in having conversations with people of faith who are really reluctant to support prison abolishment or abolition in general?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's tough. It's tough. I mean, people, there's there's little else that's more ingrained in us than the idea that cops are heroes. Just growing up in the wash of media that is overt propaganda to make it seem like cops are there to help us. They're the good guys. If you're ever in trouble, you go to them and you'll be safe. Um, they are the ones who have the corner on what is just, on how to create peace and safety. All these things are just have been drilled into us since childhood, and particularly I think for some older folks who grew up, or who actually lived their adulthoods in, say the Reagan era, the Clinton era, of these tough on crime, law and order projects. The burgeoning of the war on drugs and mass incarceration received so much propaganda around these things that it's really difficult to see cops as bad guys, to see prisons as not sources of safety, but sources of violence, which is what abolitionists are trying to make clear. Um, and they just, folks typically don't understand how systems work, don't understand structures, don't understand the importance of history. They really want to see things on an individual level, right? That these issues are about specific cops, who are bad apples, right? Or have to do with specific criminals, criminalized people who are threats or dangerous, or there's something inherently wrong with them, so they deserve incarceration or the violence of policing. And so it's just so many pieces to untangle. Like, you really have to start with, for many Christians in the spaces that I've been in, is these theologies that condition how they see people, the theologies of total depravity, that who we are, just simply left to our own devices, are these horrible, awful, rotten, demonic beings that deserve punishment, that deserve hell, left to our own devices. And so if you think that that's what people deserve automatically, then a cop putting his knee on your neck or throwing you into a jail cell is not that bad, when you actually deserve to suffer eternal conscious torment. So there's this way that Christian theology props up these things, where the logic, right, the logic of the juridical, judicial, legal logic of Christian ideas about salvation and atonement, where you're someone who has sinned, and sin is this legal category. You stand before the judgment seat, and it's a jury, and God is the jury. And because even one little sin of any kind, whether that's just you told a lie when you were younger or something, you then deserve hell, which is also a prison. These things interface with one another. So to get people to give up their most fundamental, foundational beliefs about what the Christian story is, which is this legal scene and our position within a legal court apparatus, to transform that and say, that's actually not what the story's about at all, and then all the connections you've made about that misinterpretation, misunderstanding of the Christian story to the present, you have to undo all these things. It's a lot of work, right? There's, on all those points, there's resistance. So it's not something that you get to overnight, of course. For me and the folks that I've been working with, it's taken years to get them to start to see. And I think at the end of the day, the things that touch them the most are personal stories, are, what has been touching the conscience of America over the last few years, and seeing these things visibly, viscerally, being able to see it, just having these sort of theoretical, abstract conversations about what the atonement means, what Jesus' life represented, and, the categorical but very much statistical violence of incarceration and policing. It just doesn't really touch people as quickly as it should. But conversations with real people who have lived these experiences, videos, testimonials, eyewitness accounts, just having people see over and over other human lives telling them that this is a reality that they experience, I think, opens the door. And then you start explaining why that is. Why do these people have these experiences? And then you can start telling the history. Then you can start making the structural critiques. But obviously, all that takes a very long time.
Right. And so it does take a long time for people to even start to get excited about abolition and abolition work. So I'm curious, what is your approach to get people excited about it, or if there's a specific tactic that you're using to try to engage people in the work?
Yeah. Yeah, well, at the moment it's, you can't be in person very much, so it's hard to do some of the things one might want to, direct action things, um, public gatherings, things like that, you can demonstrate, get people riled up and motivated. So at the moment it's really very quiet. I preach the sermons, but I also, social media, just posting on social media, garnering attention and following through that, connecting folks to good organizations who are doing work in their area. Um, and and so Abolition Apostles, one of the ways that it makes that first connection and gets people in the door and starts getting them educated and invested in the work is pen paling, which is something that maybe doesn't seem super obvious, maybe doesn't seem super helpful, but really is at the end of the day, to make connections with people inside who are directly affected, have been affected by policing, and now this side of it, the prison. And they are suffering the torture of engagement, all sorts of other forms of torture besides that. And you can hear their stories from their own lips, or their own pen, and start understanding that each of these individuals, the millions upon millions of individuals who are affected by these systems every year, all have names and stories and lives and places that they come from. And so to just interact with one, and then you realize there's 6 million more, this year who are being affected, you realize this is a real problem. This is not some little subsection of our culture. This is massive. And so, so getting folks connected that way, once you have, just that proximity to someone touched and affected, that gets people invested. So that's one of the main ways. And then education, like I've said, I hosted a couple in the last year, like I was saying earlier, Zoom things. They had to be Zoom because of COVID, but that got a lot of people. Okay, so like starting from education and learning about these things. Okay, this is an issue I ought to care about. How do I get involved? And then you can connect them. Say pen paling. And so, so it comes from different angles: social media, education, letter writing. I had folks in my church just watch the movie 13th, the documentary, and that really got people invested, at least an initial level. So every possible tactic, to get folks interested. And so, that's what I've been doing for the last year to get folks invested.
Sweet, thanks. I also wanted to ask if there's anything about Abolition Apostles that maybe you didn't talk about that you would like to share, like what else does the organization do, or other ways to get involved in Abolition Apostles?
Totally. Yeah. So Abolition Apostles is connected to over 2,000 incarcerated people across the country. I think we're up around 1,000 volunteers, folks who are pen paling, who are writing to folks, who provide material support. We have all sorts of fundraising avenues through which we raise funds that we then send directly to incarcerated people to help with legal expenses, commissary stuff, healthcare, whatever they need. And so one of the big projects that Abolition Apostles is involved in right now is securing a home just outside of Angola prison in Louisiana. It's a couple hours from New Orleans, and it's the site of, it's symbolic in this way that's really profound. Angola used to be a plantation, It has now grown into the largest prison in the nation, and people can't really access it. Folks who have loved ones in the prison, it's really difficult to access because it's 3 hours away from anywhere. And so Abolition Apostles has been doing this online concert, this series of concerts. It's been dozens and dozens of artists, some very well known, have been doing online concerts and raising money for the purchase of this place, which then will serve as a hospitality center where folks can come and stay and visit their loved ones, and be a site of organizing and abolitionist work and education and all kinds of stuff. So that's been going on for a little while. Abolition Apostles has a reentry formula, like a program for people to go through once they exit the prison, because of course that's one of the most vulnerable points for folks who have been involved with the criminal legal system. So there's a reentry program and all kinds of different working groups that do various things, legal support teams. One of the other things that I do within the organization is develop The Apostle, which is a newspaper that we send inside. So that has both writing from incarcerated people, as well as folks on the outside sort of writing to them, providing all sorts of information and helpful things. Last time we sent out the newspaper along with a form to help them get their stimulus checks and some information for getting their writing published from a publisher that specifically publishes incarcerated people's writing. So it's always different. There are the touchstones, the foundational things that we do, but whatever comes up, whatever people need. Sometimes there are phone zaps, call a prison and say, thousands of people calling in and saying, get so-and-so, medical attention. They're not receiving the medical attention they need. If thousands of people call, that helps sometimes. So yeah, various whatever levels of support we can provide. And it's a young organization. We haven't really got to go out and do things in a post-COVID world or a pre-COVID world. And so it's going to be interesting to see what kinds of things we can do when we can go do direct action, go show up at prisons or police precincts or, whatever needs to be done. Working in the community, we definitely see that stuff on the horizon.
Wow, that sounds like such interesting and amazing work that is being done with Abolition Apostles. Thanks so much for, touching more on that and all the different things that you all do. Before we wrap up here, I just wanted to ask you one last question. So what's been really rewarding for you during your journey in abolition, and what has been, just what keeps you going, I guess?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think because it's such a struggle because these are radical politics. They are catching on more. Something encouraging was that Miriam Kaba's book, We Do This Till We Free Us, was number 9 on the New York Times bestsellers list. So it's like, okay, so people are paying attention to this. It has this purchase in some discourse, some popular discourse. Often everyone who is representing it at the highest levels on the mainstream networks have no idea what they're actually talking about when they say abolition. It's often watered down. But in so many spaces, I'm seeing people connect to these politics, and it's really a window into radicalism in general, because abolitionist politics are about creating a world in which prisons are not necessary, right? Where we don't go to police and prisons for help, for safety. And so that really demands some other things, some reorganization of power in really expansive ways. It demands that people have conversations about the carcerality of masculinity, of whiteness, of heteronormativity, because these things are all connected. So you really see people start from here and say, okay, I can see that this is gross. I can see that this is bad. And then, but how is that interrelated with all this other stuff? And people's worldviews start really coming apart in a way that's really healthy. Starting to see how American carcerality is exported overseas through imperialism, through capitalism. And so I think the way that it really helps open up people's minds to a world that they haven't seen, that isn't just the police and prisons, but the world of which police and prisons are just the tip of the iceberg. So they see everything else. And even though that's so much, and you say, what is the abolitionist hope if you need to end the world to realize your goals? It's like, yeah, that's a lot to hope in. That's a huge ask. But the thing is that we build that now. We build that in our communities, with our friends, with our neighbors. It's not something that we just hope, just a switch we hope is going to flip at some point. As if there's someone who we're all petitioning, hey, will you just flip that switch, and then they flip it, and then we get the world we want. That's not what we're asking for. That's not how it's going to work. It's going to work by organizing. It's going to work by us getting together, being in community with one another. And so that is the thing that is so encouraging, is seeing that so often, getting together with comrades and talking, processing the world together, working through conflict, providing safety to one another, living right now the reality that we want to see in the future. And it's frustrating that it's just us. It's frustrating that it's just you and a few friends, but that's where we start. And once people see what life is like for these communities that band together and have one another's backs, I think that'll be attractive. I think that'll bring people into the fold. They'll wonder what is going on over there. How do they live their lives like that? And as we chip away, through education, through defunding the police in the ways that we can, chipping away at their authority, and moving towards alternatives, I think it's a slow process that will snowball into something really beautiful and encouraging and life-giving. So that's a little bit about what keeps me motivated and invested in this work.
Thank you so much for sharing. It's been really such a pleasure to hear you talk about, your work and how people can get involved with Abolition Apostles, and, just hearing your story and how you got your start. So thank you so much for your time and for doing this interview with me. Thank you.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you for having me.